They told her to get back on the train. A mail-order bride arrived on Christmas Eve, 1884, in rags and men's boots stuffed with newspaper, shivering so hard her bones rattled. Not a single soul on that platform wanted her. The station master would not look at her. The company man wrote her off in his notebook. The only woman there told her the last woman who went up that mountain never came back down. She had 3 pennies in her pocket and nowhere on earth to go. But the mountain man who sent for her was not looking at her clothes. He was looking at her eyes. And what happened next did not just change their lives. It rewrote the history of an entire town. This story is proof of something the world keeps forgetting. The most valuable people do not always arrive in silk. Sometimes they arrive in rags. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who changes everything. Silas Thorne did not fall in love with a pretty dress or a bank account. He fell in love with courage. And Elara Quinn did not need a man to save her. She needed someone brave enough to hand her the key and let her save herself. That is the lesson. Real worth is never on the surface. You have to look close enough to see what is underneath. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the cold of that platform and the warmth of that final fire, do me a small favor. Tap that like button. It costs you nothing, but it tells me you want more stories like this one. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have gotten on that wagon with a stranger on Christmas Eve? Share this with someone who needs to hear that their worst chapter is not their last chapter. And if you have not already, subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story. We have plenty more tales from the wild frontier coming your way. I will see you in the next one. They said she looked like a ghost when she stepped off the train, but ghosts do not bleed, and Elara Quinn was bleeding, though nobody could see it. The last of her money bought a ticket to a place she could not pronounce to marry a man she had never seen, in a territory that killed women softer than her before the first snow melted. Elara Quinn had 3 copper pennies left in her palm when the Denver and Rio Grande crested the final ridge, and the conductor called out the name of the town below. Elk Fork. She sat in the back corner of the third-class car the way she always sat in any room, near the exit. That was a habit born in the tenements of Chicago, where the girls who sat near the door were the girls who got out when the trouble started. The girls who sat in the middle were the ones who got caught. She held the matrimonial agency letter in one hand and counted the pennies with the other. 3 cents. Not enough for a bowl of soup. Not enough for a return ticket. Not enough for anything except the cold knowledge that whatever waited at the end of this rail line, she was going to have to face it with empty hands and a spine made of nothing but stubbornness. The letter described Silas Thorne as a man of property and good standing. The enclosed portrait was a pen sketch, not a photograph. Nobody paid an artist to draw an ugly man handsome. She figured the agency had lied about his appearance the same way they lied about the fare, including meals. It did not include meals. She had not eaten in 2 days. She closed her eyes and let the memory come, quick and sharp like pulling a splinter. 3 weeks ago. Foley's boarding house. 3 in the morning. She picked the lock on her bedroom door with a hairpin, the way a boy named Finn had taught her when she was 12. 3 tries, hands shaking so bad she could barely hold the pin steady. The hallway stank of boiled cabbage and pipe smoke. She crept to Foley's office, opened the desk drawer. The labor indenture was right there on top. Her name signed in his hand, not hers. He had sold her to a brothel on Wabash Avenue for $200 to settle his gambling debts. Beside the contract sat a tin box, $12 inside. She took every cent. She knew that made her a thief. But between a county jail cell and a Wabash Avenue brothel, she would take the cell. The train ground to a halt. The brakes screamed against frozen iron. Christmas Eve, 1884. The platform at Elk Fork was not crowded. 3 people stood in the cold. The station master, an old man with a tobacco-stained beard, warmed his hands over a barrel fire and did not look up. A large woman in a buffalo hide coat stood with her arms crossed, studying the train with narrowed eyes, and a thin man wearing gold-rimmed spectacles and a wool vest, too fine for this altitude, wrote something in a leather notebook with a silver pencil. No one else. Silas Thorne was not there. Ilara stepped down onto the platform. The cold hit her like a fist to the chest. 20 below, maybe colder. The air was so thin it felt like trying to breathe through a wet cloth. She was wearing a patched cotton dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was anybody's guess. A gray wool shawl that reeked of coal smoke from 2,000 miles of train cars. Men's work boots stuffed with crumpled newspaper to fill the gap around her feet. She carried a battered trunk no bigger than a bread box, and a thin prayer book with a cracked leather cover. Her mother's. Nobody laughed. Nobody sneered. That would have been better. What she got was worse. Indifference. The station master did not acknowledge her existence. The thin man with the spectacles, she would learn his name was Josiah Pimbrook, glanced up from his notebook, noted something, and looked away like she was a stray dog not worth the effort of shoeing. Only the woman in the buffalo coat stared, and her expression was not contempt. It was something closer to recognition, like she was looking at a photograph of her younger self and did not care for the resemblance. Ilara walked to the station master. Her boots crunched on the frozen platform. "Sir," she said, "I am looking for Silas Thorne." The old man jerked his thumb toward the mountains without looking up. "Up there," he said. "If the cold don't get you, he might." Ilara turned to the woman in the buffalo coat. The woman studied her for a long moment, the way a rancher studies a horse at auction, checking the teeth, checking the legs, deciding if the animal will last the season. "If you are looking for Silas Thorne," the woman said, "I would get fitted for a pine box first." Ilara felt the words land in her stomach like a stone. "Why?" she asked. "Because the last woman who went up Blackwood Ridge in winter never came back down." The train whistle blew behind her. The conductor was calling the final board. Ilara turned and watched the last link to her old life prepare to pull away. She had 3 pennies, no return ticket, no food, no plan except a letter from an agency that had already lied to her twice. The woman in the buffalo coat watched her for another moment, then pushed open the door to the building behind her. A sign above the door read, "Avery Boarding House." "At least eat something," the woman said. "If you die of starvation on the trail, that will be between me and the Almighty." Inside, the boarding house was warm. Elk stew bubbled on a cast-iron stove. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee and melted snow. Ilara stood by the door, letting the heat wash over her like water after a drought. On the wall behind the bar, she noticed a faded photograph in a wooden frame. A group of cavalry soldiers on horseback posed stiff in front of a row of canvas tents. She did not look closely. She was too hungry, too cold, too scared to care about old photographs. But if she had looked, she would have seen 2 men standing side by side in the front row. One, white, tall, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw like a river on a map. One black, holding a bugle, with the steady gaze of a man who had seen things he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Both stared into the camera with the hollow eyes of men who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Ilara did not see them. Not yet. But they were there. They had always been there. And up on the mountain, in a cabin that smelled of pine resin and old grief, Silas Thorne sat at a table and stared at a woman's sewing basket he had not touched in 4 years, and tried to decide whether bringing another woman up that mountain was an act of salvation or a death sentence. Silas Thorne had written 4 letters to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis. The first ran 2 pages long, describing the cabin, the mountain, the silence, the way the aspens turned gold in September like the whole world had caught fire. He tore it up and fed it to the stove. The second letter mentioned the silver vein under the granite. He burned that one too. The third said only, "I need a strong woman." He held it over the flame for 10 seconds before it caught. The fourth, the one he finally mailed, read, "I need a woman who knows how to survive." He did not realize until much later that it was also a confession. It was the morning of December the 24th. Silas sat at the rough-hewn table in the center of the cabin and listened to the wind. He knew the train arrived today. He knew a woman was on it, a woman he had sent for, a woman who expected a husband. He was not going down to meet her. The reason was not indifference. It was fear, not fear of the girl, fear of himself. The dream had come again last night. Big Hole, Montana Territory, August of 1877. The Nez Perce Campaign. Colonel Gibbon's order crackling through the pre-dawn dark like a whip. Fire. Fire on the village. And he had fired. They all fired. Into the sleeping lodges where families lay wrapped in buffalo robes, where children curled against their mothers, where old men dreamed whatever old men dream on the last night of their lives. He had woken at 3 in the morning with the skinning knife from under his pillow in his fist, the blade out, his hand clenched so tight the knuckles were white as bone. It took him 10 minutes to make his fingers let go. The scar on his face, the one that ran from temple to jaw like a crack in stone, was not from a grizzly bear. That was the story he let people tell. The truth was different. A Nez Perce woman, defending her child, had come at him with a skinning knife in the smoke and the screaming. She swung for his face. He could have blocked it. He had a carbine in his hands and a sidearm on his hip. But in that fraction of a second, in the hell of that burning village, he believed he deserved what was coming. So, he let the blade land. He had never told anyone that. Not Thomas, not Martha. Nobody. Martha. He looked at the sewing basket on the shelf by the window. It sat where she had left it 4 winters ago, the lid slightly open, a needle still threaded with blue cotton poking out like a tiny frozen finger. He had not moved it. He had not opened it. It sat there like a small wooden accusation, reminding him every single day that he had brought a woman to this mountain, and the mountain had killed her. Martha Thorne. Born Martha Aldridge. A school teacher from Denver with brown eyes and a laugh that sounded like creek water over stones. She married him in 1880 when he still believed he could outrun what he had done. She came up Blackwood Ridge with a trunk full of books and a head full of plans. She was going to start a school. She was going to civilize him. She was going to make the cabin into a home. She died in January of 1881, childbed fever. The blizzard sealed the pass for 9 days. He could not get her to a doctor. He could not get the baby to a doctor. He sat in this cabin in the chair he was sitting in right now and held his son for 6 hours, while the boy's heartbeat slowed and stopped. Then he wrapped them both in the quilt Martha had sewn their first summer, carried them out into the frozen dark, and dug 2 graves in ground so hard it took him 14 hours with a pickaxe and a shovel. He had not spoken her name aloud in 4 years. The front door opened without a knock. Only one person on earth walked into Silas Thorne's cabin without knocking. Thomas Delacroix stamped the snow from his boots and set a bottle of whiskey on the table. He was a tall man, lean, with the careful posture of someone who had learned early that a black man in the territories had better stand straight and speak clear if he wanted to keep breathing. He had served alongside Silas in the cavalry. He had been at Big Hole, too. He had pulled the trigger, too. But unlike Silas, Thomas had chosen to keep living among people instead of running from them. He now worked as a contract miner for Consolidated Silver Mining Company, which was the only steady employment available to a black man in the territory. That fact put him in an impossible position, because his employer was trying to destroy his only friend. "Pembroke is at the station," Thomas said, pulling off his gloves. "He knows your bride is coming in on the afternoon train." Silas looked at him. "Why does Pembroke care who I marry?" Thomas sat down across the table and poured 2 glasses. "Because Consolidated filed their challenge with the Territorial Land Office in Denver last week. Their argument is simple. You have not met the requirements of the Homestead Act. No crops, no productive livestock, no evidence of genuine land improvement. A bachelor hermit sitting on a mountain does not constitute a homestead under the law." Thomas took a sip and held the glass steady. "But a married man with a household does. She is not just a wife, Silas. She is your deed." Silas stared at the whiskey. He had known this. He had known it when he wrote the letter. He had known it when he mailed the bank draft. The silver vein running through the granite under his cabin was worth more money than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. He had refused to mine it, partly because he wanted solitude, partly because he associated pulling riches out of the earth with the violence that had defined every other part of his life. But Consolidated Silver Mining Company, operating through their territorial representative Josiah Pembroke, did not care about his reasons. They cared about the silver, and they had filed to take it. "There is more," Thomas said. He hesitated. "Pembroke dug up your service record." Silas went still. The kind of still that Thomas knew well. The kind of still that came right before something got broken. "He knows about Big Hole," Thomas said quietly. He met Silas's eyes without flinching, the way only a man who shares your sin can look at you. "He will use it if he needs to. Unfit character, violent history, unfit to hold territorial land. That is the angle." Silas said nothing for a long time. The fire popped in the hearth. The wind moaned against the cabin walls. "Does he know about Martha?" Silas asked. Thomas set down his glass. "Everybody knows about Martha, Silas. The whole town has known for 4 years. The only person who does not know is the girl sitting down at Ruth's boarding house right now, wondering why the man who sent for her could not be bothered to show up." Silas stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray winter sky, the tree line black against the snow, the trail winding down through the pines to the valley below where the lights of Elk Fork were beginning to glow in the early dark. He reached for his coat. The ride down the mountain took an hour. By the time he reached the boarding house, it was full dark. Ruth Avery opened the door with her arms folded across her chest, blocking the entrance like a fortress gate. "She is upstairs," Ruth said. "Has not eaten." "Why not?" "Because she spent her last cent on the train ticket, Silas. She does not have a penny left for a bowl of soup, and she is too proud to say so." Silas looked past Ruth to the narrow staircase leading to the upper rooms. The door at the top was closed, no candlelight underneath. She was sitting in the dark, hungry, cold, alone, and too stubborn to ask for help. He put his hand on the banister and felt the full weight of what he was about to do. Bring another woman up the mountain where the last one died. He started up the stairs. She heard the footsteps on the stairs and knew it was not Ruth. Ruth moved like a cat, silent and deliberate, a woman who had learned to walk through a world of drunk miners without making a sound. These footsteps were heavy. Each one carried the weight of a man who had learned to walk through deep snow and never learned to walk any other way. Elara sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark room and listened to those steps climb toward her. She had not lit the candle, partly because she did not want anyone to see that she had been crying, partly because in the dark she could pretend she was somewhere else, anywhere else. The steps stopped outside her door. A long pause. Then 3 knocks, slow and heavy, like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. She stood up. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. She smoothed her patched dress and lifted her chin. If this was the man she had come 2,000 miles to marry, he was not going to see her broken. She opened the door. He filled the frame. That was the first thing she noticed. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, wrapped in a coat made of wolf pelts that made him look like something that had crawled out of the wilderness and learned to stand on 2 legs. His beard was thick and dark, his hair longer than was respectable, and the scar. The scar ran from his left temple to the hinge of his jaw, a white line against wind-burned skin, impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. It was not the neat scar of a surgical knife. It was ragged, angry, the mark of something that had been trying to kill him and nearly succeeded. She looked past the scar, past the size of him, past the wolf coat and the snow in his beard. She looked at his eyes. She expected cruelty, or at least the flat hardness of a man who had been alone too long and forgotten how to be anything else. What she saw instead was exhaustion, deep, bone-level exhaustion, the kind that sleep does not fix because the thing causing it lives inside you. This was not a night. This was a man running out of road. Silas looked at her. He saw what the agency letter had not mentioned. A girl, 23 but looking younger, gaunt from months of bad food and no food. Cheekbones too sharp. Collarbones visible above the neckline of a dress that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt nobody wanted. A gray wool shawl. Men's boots with newspaper stuffed in the toes. But her spine was straight. She was not cowering. She was not crying. She was not begging. She was standing in that doorway measuring him the same way he was measuring her, with the quick, practiced assessment of someone who had learned to judge whether a person was dangerous in the first 3 seconds of meeting them. That was not a skill you learned in a finishing school. That was a skill you learned in a place where 3 seconds was all you got. "Can you cook?" he said. No greeting, no small talk. He did not know how to make small talk. He had not had a real conversation with anyone except Thomas in 4 years. "I can do whatever needs doing to stay alive," she said. Her voice was steady, a little hoarse. She had not spoken much on the train. There had been no one to speak to. "What do you expect from this arrangement?" he asked. "A roof," she said. "Food." She paused. Something crossed her face, quick as a shadow, and the next words came out before she could stop them. "And nobody hitting me." She had not meant to say that. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened immediately after, like she was trying to pull the words back into her mouth. But they were out. They hung in the cold air between them like smoke. Silas was silent for a long time. He looked at her wrists. The sleeves of the dress were long, but not long enough. He could see the edges of bruises, old ones, layered over older ones, the kind that came from being gripped and held down more than once. He did not say he was sorry. He did not offer comfort. Those things were useless. He had learned that a long time ago. "I do not hit women," he said. His voice was low, deep, the kind of voice that vibrated in your chest when he spoke. "I do not hit dogs. Anything that cannot hit back, I leave alone." She looked at him, searching his face for the lie. Because in her experience, the men who said things like that were usually the worst ones, the ones who believed their own decency right up until the whiskey kicked in. But his eyes were steady, and more importantly, they were tired. Not the tiredness of a man who was performing kindness, but the tiredness of a man who was telling the simple truth because he did not have the energy left to lie. "Here is what I am offering," Silas said. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not reaching for her. "Keeping distance. We go up the mountain. You keep the house, cooking, cleaning, the domestic work. I keep the land, the trapping, the livestock. Marriage on paper. Separate rooms. There is a bolt on the inside of the upstairs bedroom door. Use it if it makes you feel safe." He paused. "You owe me nothing except work. I owe you nothing except a roof and safety. If you want to leave in the spring when the pass opens, I will pay your fare wherever you want to go. No debt, no obligations, a clean deal." She studied him, turning the words over in her mind the way she had learned to turn over every offer she had ever received, looking for the hook, the hidden cost, the clause that would trap her. "Why?" she asked. "Why send for a mail-order bride at all? You do not seem like a man who wants company." Something flickered in his eyes. A shadow. He said, "I need a homestead claim to hold my land. The law says a family strengthens the claim." He stopped. That was the practical answer. She deserved the practical answer. She did not need the other answers, the ones about the silence that had grown so loud it was deafening, the ones about the sewing basket on the shelf that he could not bring himself to move. "That is honest," she said. "It is." "All right," she said. "Deal." She put out her hand, small, thin, the knuckles red from cold. He looked at it for a second, then wrapped his own hand around it. His hand was enormous, calloused, rough as tree bark. He could have crushed every bone in her fingers without effort. But his grip was measured, firm enough to mean something, gentle enough to mean something else. They shook once and let go. Ruth was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She had been listening as Ruth always listened, because in a mining town, the woman who did not listen was the woman who ended up on the wrong end of someone else's bad decision. She pulled Silas aside in the hallway while Ilara gathered her trunk. "That girl has bruises on her wrists," Ruth said, her voice low and hard. "Old ones. Layered. Somebody tied her up more than once, Silas, not just hit her." "Tied her?" "I saw," Silas said. "Did you ask?" "No." "Then ask. Because if someone is looking for her, they will come looking here. And I like my boarding house in one piece." Before Silas could answer, the front door of the boarding house opened, and Josiah Pembroke stepped inside. He wore his gold-rimmed spectacles and that vest that was too fine for the altitude, and a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. He nodded to Ruth. He nodded to Silas. "Congratulations, Thorne," Pembroke said pleasantly. He glanced toward the stairs where Ilara was coming down with her trunk. "I hope she takes to the altitude. Some people find it difficult to breathe up on the ridge." His tone was conversational. His eyes were calculating. He was already measuring her the way he measured everything, by its utility, by its value, by its usefulness, in the long, slow chess game he was playing for the silver under Blackwood Ridge. Silas said nothing. He took Ilara's trunk from her hand, which surprised her because no man had ever carried anything for her before. He walked out through the front door into the freezing dark. The wagon was waiting. 2 heavy horses, a buckboard loaded with supplies. Silas set the trunk in the back and held out his hand to help her up. She hesitated, then took it. He lifted her onto the seat like she weighed nothing. He wrapped a heavy buffalo robe around her shoulders, tucking it tight against the wind. They pulled away from the boarding house into the darkness. The road climbed immediately. The temperature dropped with every foot of elevation. The wind came off the peaks like it had a personal grudge against anything warm-blooded. They rode in silence for 20 minutes. The horses picked their way through the snow, their breath making clouds in the lantern light. Stars appeared above the tree line, hard and bright and cold. "The scar," Ilara said. Her voice came out small against the wind. "Was it from the war?" Silas did not turn his head. "It was from a mistake," he said. She did not press. She understood. She had her own scars, her own mistakes, her own doors she did not open, because what waited behind them was worse than not knowing. But in the silence that followed, she understood something that settled into her bones alongside the cold. They were both running. He was running from his mountain. She was running from her city. And maybe that was the only foundation a marriage like this needed. Not love, not even trust, just a shared direction, a way. The wagon climbed into the dark. Snow began to fall, soft and heavy, muffling the world. And somewhere behind them, in the warm glow of the boarding house, Ruth Avery poured herself a glass of whiskey, looked at the old cavalry photograph on the wall, and whispered to no one at all, "God help that girl." The cabin was not beautiful. The cabin was a creature. It breathed through gaps in the timber, groaned when the wind shifted direction, and smelled of 7 years of solitude layered over something older and sadder that Ilara could not yet name. They arrived near midnight on Christmas Eve. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his grip firm and impersonal, then disappeared into the darkness to stable the horses. He left her standing in front of the heavy oak door with the buffalo robe still wrapped around her shoulders and the snow falling soft as ash. "Go inside," he called from the stable. "Do not wander. The wolves are hungry this year." She pushed open the door. The warmth hit her like a wall. Embers glowed in a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. The floors were smooth pine, worn to a honey color by years of boot soles. The main room was cluttered but solid. Trapping gear hung from pegs on the wall. Maps were tacked above a heavy oak desk. Ammunition boxes were stacked in one corner beside a gun rack holding 2 rifles and a shotgun. Animal hides, beaver and elk, and something gray she thought might be wolf, were draped over the backs of chairs. It was masculine, functional, and profoundly neglected. Grease caked the kitchen pans. Dust lay thick on every surface. Flour had been spilled on the pantry floor and never swept up. But it was warm, and it was solid, and no one was going to walk through that door and hit her. Silas came in stamping snow from his boots. He set her trunk at the foot of the stairs. "Upstairs," he said, "first door on the left. That is your room. There is a bolt on the inside." He pointed to a narrow cot by the fire. "I sleep down here. I listen for the livestock." He moved to the kitchen, rummaged through the pantry, and produced dried venison, potatoes, and a blackened coffee pot. Within 30 minutes, a steaming bowl of stew sat on the table. "Eat," he said. She ate. She ate like a stray dog finding a bone, fast and desperate, barely breathing between bites, burning her tongue on the broth. She could feel him watching her from his chair by the fire, his pipe lit, his expression unreadable. He did not mock her hunger. He did not comment on it. He simply sat and smoked and let her eat. "What is your name?" he asked when she had scraped the bowl clean. "The agency just called you candidate number 4. "Elara," she said. She caught herself wiping her mouth on the back of her hand and reached for the cloth napkin he had set beside the bowl. "Elara Quinn." "Well, Elara Quinn," Silas said. He stood and banked the fire for the night, arranging the logs with a practiced hand. "Merry Christmas." He walked to the window and looked out at the storm. Snow was coming down hard now, the wind driving it sideways against the glass. "Get some sleep," he said. "You're safe here. Nobody comes up Blackwood Ridge unless I let them." She climbed the stairs, her legs heavy with exhaustion and stew. The bedroom was simple, a bed with a straw mattress and a pile of quilts, a small window looking out onto white nothing, and the bolt. A heavy iron bolt on the inside of the door. She closed the door. She put her hand on the bolt. She thought about the people on the train platform, the woman's warning about the last woman who went up this mountain. She thought about Silas standing between her and the wind, his hand the size of a shovel blade, offering her a deal that asked for nothing except work and gave her nothing except safety. She left the bolt unlatched. She crawled under the quilts and felt the warmth of the stew in her belly and the weight of 2,000 miles in her bones. For the first time in 10 years, she fell asleep without one eye open. The days that followed moved at the pace of survival. Elara woke before dawn every morning because the habit of the slums, where sleeping past sunrise meant missing the breadline, was impossible to break. She would lie under the quilts for a moment, listening. The cabin was always silent at that hour. Silas rose even earlier than she did, slipping out to check the trapline and the livestock while the stars were still burning. She used those first dark hours alone to learn the cabin. The kitchen was a disaster, but its bones were good. Cast iron skillets hung from hooks above the stove. A pantry held tins of beans, sacks of flour and coffee, strips of dried elk and venison. She scrubbed the pans until the iron was smooth and black. She swept the flour from the pantry floor. She organized the shelves. But it was not the kitchen that interested her most. It was the bookshelf. Tucked into a corner beside the gun rack, easy to miss beneath a layer of dust, sat a small shelf holding 5 books. Milton's Paradise Lost, a volume of Shakespeare's histories, a leather-bound journal with a military seal on the cover, a book of geological surveys, and a worn copy of the King James Bible with a woman's name written on the inside cover in faded ink. Martha Thorne. Elara held the Bible for a long moment. She did not open it past the first page. But she understood now that the woman who had never come back down from Blackwood Ridge had a name. She put the Bible back exactly where she found it. The contradictions of Silas Thorne multiplied the more she looked. He was the kind of man who could field dress a deer in 10 minutes but kept a volume of Milton on his shelf. He was the kind of man who slept with a skinning knife under his pillow but folded his blankets with military precision every morning. He was the kind of man who barely spoke, but had written a letter to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. That was, when she thought about it, one of the more honest things a man had ever said to her. I need a woman who knows how to survive. She found the handkerchief on the 5th day. It was in the back of a bureau drawer in the main room, folded carefully, deliberately preserved. A white cotton square embroidered with the letter M in faded blue thread. The stitching was fine, delicate, the work of a woman who cared about beautiful things. Ilara held it and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, but the weight of what it meant. A man who folds a handkerchief this carefully is a man who once loved someone enough to keep this small piece of cloth when everything else was gone. She put it back. She did not ask. On the 12th day, she found something else. She was clearing snow from behind the cabin, carving a path to the woodpile, when her shovel struck something solid that was not rock. She brushed away the snow. A small wooden cross, barely a foot tall, weathered and leaning to one side, planted in the frozen earth behind the stable. No name, no date, just wood and silence. She stared at it. She did not ask. The rhythm of their days settled into a pattern. Silas left at dawn, returned midday, left again, returned at dark. He taught her nothing with words. He would demonstrate a task once, splitting wood, starting the cook stove damper, hauling water from the well with the cracked leather bucket, and then he would leave. She had to figure it out or fail. She split wood and failed 3 times, blistering her palms raw before she found the rhythm. She started the cook stove and filled the cabin with smoke twice before she understood the damper. She hauled water and slopped half of it on the frozen path and nearly broke her ankle on the ice. She did not complain. Complaining was a luxury for people who had choices. They ate together but spoke little. He slept by the fire. She slept behind the unlatched door. They moved around each other like 2 planets sharing an orbit, close enough to feel the gravity, far enough to never collide. The silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had forgotten how to share space with another human being and were slowly, carefully remembering. On the 12th day, something changed. Ilara was washing clothes at the creek, her hands red and aching in the ice water, when a rifle shot cracked from the tree line. The sound split the silence like an axe through pine. She dropped the clothes, her heart slammed into her ribs. Every nerve in her body lit up with a terror that had nothing to do with wolves or bears, and everything to do with the sound of a man's anger breaking through a locked door. She ran. She ran back to the cabin, threw herself inside, and slammed the bolt home. She grabbed a kitchen knife and stood with her back against the far wall, shaking so hard the blade rattled in her grip. Silas came back 2 hours later with a buck draped over his shoulders. He saw the bolted door. He saw her face through the window glass, white and wide-eyed. He set the deer down on the porch and stood there for a moment, very still. He did not ask what happened to her. He did not ask why a single rifle shot sent a grown woman running for cover with a knife in her hand. He understood. He understood because he knew the sound of fear that had nothing to do with the present danger and everything to do with an old one. "Next time I will fire a signal shot first," he said through the door. "Too quick, then one. That means it is me." It was a small adjustment, a tiny shift in the pattern of his days, but it was the first time Silas Thorne had changed his behavior for another person in 7 years. And that, for a man who had lived alone so long that the sound of his own voice startled him, was an act of extraordinary consequence. On New Year's Eve, they sat by the fire in the 2 chairs that Silas had pulled closer together without comment. The flames threw dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind had died for once, and the silence was the kind that fills your ears like water. "I can read," Ilara said. Silas looked at her over the rim of his coffee. "I know," he said. "You have been reading the Milton when you think I'm not watching." She stared at him. "You did not say anything. Was not my business." A pause. The fire popped and settled. "But if you want more," he said, "there is a crate of books in the cellar. The mice have not gotten to all of them." Ilara smiled. It came slowly, like sunrise in winter. a gradual warming that started at the corners of her mouth and worked its way to her eyes. It was the first time she had smiled since leaving Chicago, the first time in longer than she could remember. In the firelight, Silas saw it. Not beauty. Not yet. Something rarer. The face of a person remembering what it felt like to not be afraid. The storm came down from the Continental Divide like a living thing, a white wall of wind that swallowed Blackwood Ridge whole. It hit at 2 in the morning on January the 14th, and it did not stop for 11 days. Elara woke to the sound of the cabin shuddering. The timbers groaned like a ship in high seas. Snow was piling against the windows, already halfway up the glass, and the wind was screaming through the gaps in the walls with a sound like a woman crying. She pulled the quilts tighter and listened to Silas moving downstairs, feeding the fire, checking the door seals, moving with the calm efficiency of a man who had survived enough winters to know that panic killed faster than cold. By morning, the door would not open. The snow had drifted 4 feet deep against the front of the cabin. Silas went out through a narrow window on the lee side, dropping into waist-deep powder, and spent 3 hours digging a path to the stable. The horses were alive, stamping and nervous in the stone enclosure. But the smaller livestock pen on the east side had collapsed under the weight of the snow. 3 chickens were dead, frozen stiff. He was coming back from reinforcing the stable roof when it happened, black ice invisible under a fresh layer of powder. His right boot slid forward. He went down hard on his left side. He heard the crack before he felt it. 2 ribs on his left side, maybe 3. The pain came a second later, sharp and white, stealing the breath from his lungs. He lay in the snow for a full minute, staring at the gray sky, feeling the cold seep through his coat. Then he got up. He got up because there was no one to help him up. And lying in the snow on Blackwood Ridge was the same as dying in the snow on Blackwood Ridge. He made it back inside. He said nothing to Elara about the ribs. But she saw. She saw the way he favored his left side when he reached for the coffee pot. She saw the sharp intake of breath when he bent to feed the stove. She saw him catch himself against the wall when he thought she was not looking, his face tight with pain he would not name. She had seen men hide injuries before. Her stepfather, Declan Foley, used to do it, absorbing a beating from a creditor and then pretending nothing had happened because admitting weakness meant admitting he was not in control. But Silas was different. Silas was hiding the injury not because of pride, or not entirely because of pride, but because admitting he was hurt meant admitting he could not protect her alone. And that, for Silas Thorne, was more frightening than the cracked ribs themselves. By the 4th day, he was worse. The ribs were not setting right. A low fever had settled in, not dangerous yet, but enough to slow him down, to make his movements careful and his breathing shallow. He sat by the fire wrapped in a blanket, his jaw clenched, his eyes furious at his own body for betraying him. Elara did not ask for permission. She simply took over. She split the wood. Her arms ached and her blisters reopened. But the rhythm was in her now, and the axe fell true. She fed the horses, hauling grain through snow that came up past her hips. She melted snow for water, bucket after bucket, keeping the stove going day and night. She checked the trap line, following Silas's boot prints from previous days like a map carved in white, carrying the rifle he had taught her to load but not yet taught her to shoot. On the 5th night, she sat beside his cot and tore bedsheets into strips. "Hold still," she said. "I do not need hold still." She bound his ribs. Her hands were steady. Not because she was not scared, she was terrified, but because she had learned a long time ago that shaking hands drop things. And in the world she came from, dropped things meant you did not eat. She wound the strips tight, pressing her palm flat against his side to feel the break, adjusting the tension until the binding held the bones in place. He watched her work with an expression she could not read. He hated every second of his helplessness. He snarled at her once when she pulled the binding too tight. She ignored him. He snarled again when she told him to lie back down. She ignored him again. "You are a terrible patient," she said. "And you are a terrible nurse," he said. But there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a faint edge of reliance, a crack in the wall of self-sufficiency that had kept him alive and kept him alone for 7 years. He was allowing her to help him. For Silas Thorne, that was an act of vulnerability greater than anything he had done since the day he let a Nez Perce woman cut his face open in a burning village. The food ran low on day 8. Ilara rationed, half portions, then quarter. She gave Silas the larger share and told him she had already eaten. She hid her portion behind the flour tin in the pantry, untouched. He found it on day 10. He found the cold bowl of stew tucked behind the tin, the crust of bread she had set aside, the lie sitting there in plain view for anyone who bothered to look. His anger was sudden and fierce. "Do not ever starve yourself to feed me," he said. His voice was low and shaking, and not from the fever. "I have buried one." He stopped. The sentence broke in the air like a branch under too much snow. He had almost said it. "I have buried one woman already." Ilara heard the shape of what he did not say. She filed it away in the place she kept all the pieces of the puzzle she was slowly assembling. The handkerchief with the embroidered M, the wooden cross behind the stable, the sewing basket on the shelf, the Bible with a woman's name on the first page. She did not push. She did not ask. She simply sat down, pulled her hidden portion from behind the flour tin, and ate it in front of him. "We eat together," she said, "or we do not eat at all." He stared at her. Then he nodded once, and something in the hard geography of his face shifted just a fraction, like a mountain settling after a tremor. The storm broke on day 11. The silence was almost worse than the wind. 11 days of howling, screaming, cabin-shaking fury, and then nothing. Just white. Just stillness. Just the sound of their own breathing in a world that had gone completely, absolutely quiet. Silas limped to the door. He put his hand on the latch. Ilara stood behind him. He pushed the door open. The world was white. Blinding, featureless white. The snow was waist-deep from the porch to the tree line. The sky above was a hard, aching blue, the color of something that has been scoured clean. They stood in the doorway side by side, both thinner, both exhausted, both alive. She looked at him. He looked at her. No words. But something had changed between them that could never change back. They had survived something together, the two of them against the mountain. And survival is a bond older and deeper than love. Love is a choice. Survival is a fact. And the fact was that Ilara Quinn, the mail-order bride who arrived in rags and newspaper boots, had carried Silas Thorne through the worst storm of the decade on nothing but stubbornness and stew. He knew it. She knew he knew it. He knew he. Neither of them said a word about it. The moment broke when Ilara spotted movement in the valley below. A single rider, small as an ant against the white expanse, picking his way up the mountain trail. Silas squinted. His expression darkened. "That is Thomas," he said. "He does not ride up here in winter unless something is wrong." Thomas arrived an hour later, half frozen, his horse steaming. He dismounted stiffly and beat the snow from his coat. His face told the story before his mouth did. "Pembroke has moved up the hearing date," Thomas said. "May. Territorial Court in Denver will send a judge." He paused, and the pause was worse than the words. "And he has added a new argument to the filing." Silas waited. "Failure to maintain safe habitation," Thomas said carefully, watching Silas's face, "as evidenced by the death of a prior dependent on the property." The color drained from Silas's face, white as the snow behind him, white as the scar on his jaw. "He is using Martha," Thomas said quietly. "He is using Martha and the baby." Ilara stood in the doorway watching this exchange and felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. Not the full picture, not yet. but enough to know that the ghost in this cabin had a name, and the mountain man she had married was carrying the dead weight of more than just solitude. The thaw came in March, and Alara learned that spring in the Rockies is not a season of renewal. It is a season of revelation. The snow pulls back like a sheet lifted from a body, and everything that has been hidden underneath is laid bare for the world to see. The wildflowers came first, purple columbine and white mountain daisy pushing through the mud around the cabin like tiny flags of surrender. The creek behind the stable unfroze, filling the air with the sound of running water for the first time in months. The aspens at the tree line showed the faintest blush of green at their tips, like the mountains were holding their breath and waiting to exhale. And behind the cabin, the snow pulled away from the earth and revealed what Ilara had been waiting for and dreading. 2 crosses. Not 1. 2. The first was the cross she had found in December, the weathered one she had brushed the snow away from, and not asked about. The second was smaller, barely 8 inches tall, half hidden beneath a snowdrift that had been a foot deep in January. It stood beside the larger cross, close enough to touch. 2 graves, one woman-sized, one barely large enough for what it held. Ilara stood on the back porch in the early morning light and looked at those 2 crosses and felt the full shape of the stories she had been piecing together for 3 months settle into place. The handkerchief with the M, the sewing basket on the shelf, the Bible with the name Martha Thorne written on the first page. The sentence Silas had not finished during the blizzard. "I have buried one." She did not ask Silas, not yet. She had learned in the slums of Chicago and in the frozen silence of Blackwood Ridge that the truth is something you approach the way you approach a wounded animal. Slowly, from the side, with your hands open and visible. She rode down to Elk Fork alone. Silas's ribs had healed enough by March that he could manage the cabin and the trapline without her, though he did not like her going down the mountain by herself and said so 3 times. She went anyway. She was not the trembling girl who had stepped off the train at Christmas. She had split wood and bound broken ribs and survived 11 days of blizzard on quarter rations. She could handle a horse on a mountain trail. Ruth Avery was behind the bar of the boarding house when Ilara walked in. She looked up, and something in her face shifted. Recognition. Not of the girl who had arrived in rags, but of the woman who had come through the other side of winter and was still standing. "Well," Ruth said, "you made it." Ilara sat down at the bar. Ruth poured 2 whiskeys without asking. "Who is buried behind Silas's cabin?" Ilara said. Ruth set the bottle down slowly. She picked up her glass, took a sip, and looked at Ilara with the steady gaze of a woman who had been carrying other people's secrets for 30 years and was tired of the wait. "Martha Thorne," Ruth said. "Born Martha Aldridge. She was a school teacher from Denver. Pretty girl, brown eyes, brown hair, a laugh that could make you forget you were living in a mining camp at the end of the world. She married Silas in 1880, came up the mountain with a trunk full of books and a heart full of plans. She was going to start a school for the miners' children. She was going to make that cabin into a home." Ruth paused. She took another sip. She got with child that first summer. The baby came in January of 1881, but something went wrong. Childbed fever, you know what that is. Ilara nodded. She knew. Every woman in every tenement in Chicago knew. "The blizzard hit the same week," Ruth continued. "Sealed the pass for 9 days. Silas could not get her to a doctor. Could not get the baby to a doctor. He sat in that cabin and held his wife's hand while she burned up with fever. And then he held his son, a boy, never named, for 6 hours while the child's heart got slower and slower and stopped. The boarding house was quiet. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped in the cold. He came down the mountain the next morning," Ruth said, carrying both of them wrapped in a quilt she had made. "He walked into this very room, set them down on that table right there, and did not say a single word. He buried them behind the cabin. Then he went back up the mountain and did not come down again for 2 years." Ruth looked at Ilara. "I am telling you this because you deserve to know whose house you are living in, and because if you are going to stay, you need to understand what that man is carrying. and decide if you are strong enough to carry it with him. Elara rode back up the mountain in the afternoon light. The trail was muddy now, the snow melting fast, and the horse picked its way carefully through the slick patches. She did not hurry. She needed the time to think. She found Silas behind the cabin, kneeling in the mud beside the crosses. He was resetting the larger one, which had tilted in the thaw. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, not from the effort. From something that lived deeper than muscle and bone. Something that had been shaking inside him for 4 years, and had never once found its way to the surface where anyone could see. She sat down on the ground 3 feet away from him, close enough to be present, far enough to give him room. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the crosses and said, "What was her name?" He went still, completely still, the way he went still when something was about to break. "Martha," he said, "and the baby." His jaw worked, his throat moved. When he spoke, his voice was level, but the effort of keeping it level was visible in every line of his body. "I did not name him. He was alive for 6 hours. I held him the whole time. His hands, those enormous calloused hands, clenched in the mud. The pass was snowed in. I could not get her to a doctor. I could not get him to a doctor. I sat in that cabin and watched them both die, and I could not do a goddamn thing about it." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were dry but devastated, the eyes of a man who had cried himself empty years ago and had nothing left but the memory of what crying felt like. "That is who you married, Elara, a man who buries people." She did not reach for him. She did not say it was not your fault because she knew from her own experience that those words are worthless when you are drowning in guilt. They bounce off like pebbles thrown at a fortress wall. Instead, she said, "My mother died in a room with walls so thin I could hear the neighbors eating supper. I sat with her for 2 days because I could not afford a doctor and I was too proud to beg for help. She was 39 years old. I was 14. I held her hand the same way you held his." She looked at the crosses. "At least you buried them somewhere beautiful," she said quietly. Silas stared at her. And something inside him, some wall, some dam, some structure that he had built over 7 years of silence and solitude and sleeping with a knife under his pillow, cracked, not broke. Breaking would come later, or maybe never, because some structures are too old and too heavy to break all at once. But it cracked. A fissure opened in the stone. And through that fissure, for the first time since he carried Martha down the mountain, wrapped in a quilt, light got in. That night they sat by the fire, closer than they had ever sat before. Not touching, but the geography of the room had changed. The chairs that had been 3 feet apart were now 2 feet apart. His knee was almost touching hers. The heat of the fire wrapped around both of them, and the silence was not empty. It was full, full of things spoken and things still waiting to be spoken. "Pembroke is going to use her at the hearing," Silas said. "Martha, the baby. He will say I am unfit, that I let a woman die on this mountain." Elara stared into the flames. "Then we need to make sure the hearing goes our way." Silas turned to her. "Elara, the fair money is still in the tin on the shelf. The pass is open. Spring is here. You can leave." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I am choosing not to, but I am choosing it because I want to, not because I have no other choice. There is a difference, Silas, and that difference matters." He held her gaze. Then he nodded slowly. "If you stay," he said, "I need you to know who I am, all of it, not just Martha." He told her about Big Hole. He told it flat, without drama, without justification, staring into the fire the way a man stares into a fire when he is reading his own verdict aloud. He told her about the order, about the sleeping village, about the women and children, about the scar, and the Nez Perce woman who gave it to him, and the choice he made to let the blade land. When he was done, the fire popped. A log shifted and sent sparks spiraling toward the chimney. The silence in the cabin was enormous. "My stepfather sold me to a brothel," Elara said, to pay his gambling debts. I stole $12 from him to run. If they catch me, I go to the county jail. 2 confessions in one night. 2 people sitting by the same fire, showing each other the ugliest thing they owned and waiting to see if the other person got up and left. Neither of them moved. Ilara did not say, "I forgive you." That was not what this was. This was not forgiveness. This was something older and more fundamental. This was 2 people saying, "Here is who I am, every rotten piece of it, every broken board, every crack in the foundation," and the other person staying seated, not out of pity, not out of obligation, out of the simple, radical act of choosing to remain. The fire burned low. The cabin settled around them. Outside, the spring night was cold and clear, and the stars over Blackwood Ridge burned like holes punched in black cloth, letting the light of some other, better world shine through. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April, tucked inside the weekly mail packet that Thomas brought up from town. No return name on the envelope, just an address written in a cramped, familiar hand. Chicago, Illinois. Ilara saw the handwriting and felt her whole body flinch. The way a horse flinches when it hears a rattlesnake. Full body, gut first, the kind of reaction that happens before the brain has time to think. Her hands went cold, her vision narrowed. For one terrible second, she was back in the boarding house on the south side, 14 years old, listening to Declan Foley's boots on the stairs, counting the seconds until the door opened and whatever happened next happened. She took the letter to the creek where Silas could not see her, and she opened it with shaking hands. The letter was short. Declan Foley did not waste words. He wanted his $12 back. If she did not send the money within 30 days, he would prosecute the theft complaint he had already filed with the Chicago police. Enclosed was a copy of the criminal complaint, stamped and dated, awaiting prosecution. Her name, her description, fugitive from justice, $12. The price of her freedom, the price of a train ticket to the end of the world, and now the price of a noose around her neck that Foley could tighten whenever he chose. She sat by the creek and stared at the letter until the words blurred. The water rushed past her, cold and indifferent, carrying snowmelt from the peaks down to the valley below. She thought about throwing the letter into the current and pretending she had never seen it. She thought about packing her trunk and disappearing before the next sunrise. She thought about telling Silas. She did not tell Silas. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the letter in her hand was not the real threat. The real threat was a second letter, one she never saw, sent 3 weeks earlier from Josiah Pembroke's office in Elk Fork to Declan Foley's boarding house in Chicago. Pembroke's offer was simple and efficient, as all of Pembroke's offers were. If Foley would provide sworn testimony that Ilara Quinn was a fugitive thief, Consolidated Silver Mining Company would cover his legal expenses to pursue extradition from Colorado territory. The goal was surgical. Remove the girl. Collapse the marriage. Collapse the homestead claim. Acquire the land. Pembroke did not hate Ilara Quinn. He did not hate Silas Thorne. He was simply solving a problem the way he solved all problems, with paper and money and the patient application of pressure. Ilara hid the letter under the mattress in her room. She began to change. The change was subtle at first. She spoke less. She avoided Silas's eyes at meals. She locked the bedroom door at night for the first time since the second week. She moved through the cabin with the careful, measured steps of someone planning an exit. Silas noticed. He noticed everything about her, because noticing things was how he had stayed alive for 38 years, and because, though he would not have admitted it under pain of death, he had started to pay attention to Ilara Quinn in a way that had nothing to do with homestead claims and everything to do with the way she smiled when she thought he was not watching. He noticed the change, and he misread it completely. He thought she was pulling away because of what he had told her. Big hole. The sleeping village. The scar. He thought she had heard the truth about who he was and decided she could not stay in the same house with a man who had done what he had done. He thought she was disgusted. so he pulled away too. He stayed out on the trapline longer. He spoke less at meals. He stopped putting the 2 extra logs on the fire that he had started adding because he knew she liked the cabin warm in the evenings. They were pushing each other away, both of them trying to protect the other, both of them succeeding only in opening a distance that grew wider every day. The dark moment came on a Thursday night in late April. Silas was asleep by the fire, his breathing slow and steady, the skinning knife under his pillow, the Winchester propped against the wall within arm's reach. The cabin was quiet. The spring night was cold, but not bitter. Through the window, the half-moon lit the snow patches on the ridge in silver. Elara crept down the stairs. She moved in silence, the way Finn had taught her to move in the tenements, weight on the balls of her feet, testing each floorboard before committing. She crossed the main room, stepping over the creaking board near the kitchen, and went to the shelf where Silas kept his money box. It was a simple tin box with a hinged lid, not locked. 7 years of fur-trapping income, converted to coin and paper. She opened it. She did not count it, not at first. She just looked at it. Enough for a train ticket east. Enough for a new name in a new city. Enough to disappear before Foley or Pembroke or anyone else could touch her. The old Elara, the girl from Chicago, the one who picked locks and stole $12 in the dark and ran, was fully present in that moment. She could feel that girl like a second skin, tight and familiar, whispering the logic of survival. Take it. Go. You have done this before. You know how to vanish. He will wake up in the morning and you will be gone, and he will be angry, but he will be safe. Foley will have no one to chase. Pembroke will have no one to remove. The problem will solve itself. She held the money for a full minute. Then she put it back. She closed the lid. She sat down on the floor in the dark with her back against the wall and wrapped her arms around her knees and shook. Not because she was cold, because she had wanted to take it. Because the survival instinct that had kept her alive for 23 years in a world that did not care whether she lived or died was the same instinct that could destroy the only good thing she had ever been given. She was still sitting there when the floorboard creaked, and she looked up, and Silas was standing in the doorway of the main room, watching her. The moonlight through the window lit one side of his face. The scar was in shadow. His eyes were not angry. They were not accusing. They were something worse. They were understanding. He had heard her open the money box. He had been awake the whole time. He had lain there and listened to her count his money and made the choice not to stop her, because stopping her would have been the same as locking a cage, and he had promised her on the first night that she could leave whenever she wanted. Neither of them spoke. He went back to his cot. She went back upstairs. They did not mention it in the morning, but the distance between them had become unbearable, and it was Thomas Delacroix who finally broke it open. He found Elara at the creek 2 days later. She was kneeling on the bank, splashing water on her face, and he could see that her eyes were swollen and red. Thomas sat down on a rock beside her and said nothing for a long time. He was good at that. He had learned in the cavalry that sometimes the most useful thing a person can do is sit nearby and wait. She told him everything: the letter, Foley, the theft charge, the criminal complaint filed in Chicago, the terror of being dragged back to a city where she was property. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "You have to tell Silas." "I cannot." "You have to, because Pembroke knows about this. If he does not know yet, he will soon. And if he springs it at the hearing in May, it will blindside both of you. In a courtroom, surprises kill." Elara wiped her eyes. "If I tell Silas, he will do something reckless." Thomas shook his head. "He will do something necessary. There is a difference. Let the man fight for you, Elara. He has been waiting a long time for something worth fighting for." She told Silas that evening. The fight that followed was not the explosive, door-slamming kind. It was worse. It was quiet and cold and precise, like surgery without anesthesia. Silas stood by the fire, his back to her, his hands gripping the mantelpiece so hard his knuckles were white. "You did not trust me," he said. His voice was level, but the control was costing him everything. "I told you everything. Big hole. Martha. The worst of what I am. And you could not tell me about a $12 theft charge." Elara stood on the other side of the room. Her arms were crossed, not in defiance, but in the instinct to protect her own chest, the way she had stood 1,000 times in the presence of a man's anger. "You do not understand what it is like to be owned," she said. He turned. "I own you. I have never even touched you, not you." She shook her head. "The world, every piece of paper, every law, every man who has ever had a say in where I go and what I do. My stepfather, the agency, the courts, they all think I belong to someone. Every choice I have ever made has been made inside someone else's cage." The room went silent. The fire crackled between them. Silas stared at her, and for the first time he saw not the brave girl who had survived the blizzard, not the steady hands that had bound his broken ribs, but the cornered animal underneath. The girl who had been sold and caged and beaten, and who had learned that the only way to survive was to run before the cage door closed. He recognized her, because he saw the same animal in the mirror every morning. The anger drained out of him like water through a cracked dam. He picked up his coat. He picked up his rifle. "Where are you going?" she said. "Denver. To hire a lawyer." "A lawyer? With what money?" "7 years of pelts," he said. He stopped at the door. He did not turn around, but his voice, when he spoke, was stripped of everything except the truth. "If I am not back in 4 days, Thomas will come for you. The money box is unlocked. I know you know where it is." She looked at his back. He looked at the door. He knew she had almost taken the money. She knew he knew. Neither of them said a word about it. He walked out into the dark. May of 1885. The makeshift courtroom on the second floor of the Elkhorn Saloon smelled of spilled beer and wet sawdust. Someone had dragged in benches from the church and lined them in rows facing a table at the front where a judge's chair waited. The windows were open to let in the spring air, and from outside came the sounds of Elk Fork going about its business, horses clopping on the mud street, a blacksmith hammering, someone laughing in the general store. But inside the saloon, no one was laughing. The territorial judge had traveled 4 days from Denver. He wore a black coat and carried a leather satchel and had the thin, patient face of a man who had spent 30 years listening to people lie and had developed an instinct for truth that cut through pretense like a hot knife. This was not a jury trial. It was a territorial land hearing, a civil proceeding to determine the validity of Silas Thorne's homestead claim on Blackwood Ridge. But everyone in Elk Fork understood that what was really being decided was whether a damaged man and a mail-order bride had earned the right to exist on a piece of mountain that a mining company wanted to own. The saloon was packed. Miners, shopkeepers, ranchers from the lower valleys all crowded onto the benches or stood along the walls. Ruth Avery sat in the back row with her arms crossed and her jaw set like a woman prepared to watch a hanging. Thomas Delacroix stood near the door, his hat in his hands, the only black face in the room. Silas sat at the left table. Beside him was the woman he had ridden 4 days round trip to Denver to hire, spending every dollar he had made in 7 years of trapping. Margaret Hale. She was one of the few women practicing law in Colorado Territory. A hard-boned woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back tight and a voice that could cut glass. She had taken Silas's case not for the money, but because she had spent her career fighting mining companies that used the law to steal land from people who could not afford to fight back. Elara sat behind Silas on the first bench. She wore the best dress she owned, which was still patched and faded but clean. Her hair was pulled back, her hands were flat on her knees, and they were not shaking. At the right table sat Josiah Pembroke and a lawyer from Denver named Harlan Cross, a man with a reputation for winning land cases for Consolidated by any means the law allowed, and a few means it probably did not. The judge called the hearing to order. Pembroke's case was strong. That was what made it dangerous. It was not the case of a cartoon villain twirling his mustache. It was the case of a well-prepared corporate representative who understood the law better than most lawyers and used it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. Cross laid out the argument in 4 clean strokes. First, Silas Thorne had not met the cultivation requirements of the Homestead Act. 7 years on the property and not a single acre under plow. No crops, no productive agriculture, no commercial use of the land whatsoever. The act required proof of improvement in cultivation. A cabin and a trapline did not meet the standard. Second, the marriage to Elara Quinn had never been registered with the county clerk. Under territorial law, an unregistered marriage had no legal standing. The homestead claim required a household. An unregistered arrangement between a hermit and a transient woman did not constitute a household. Third, Silas Thorne had a documented history of violence. His service record from the Nez Perce campaign showed participation in the assault on a civilian settlement. His character was not consistent with the responsible stewardship of territorial land. And fourth, Cross paused before this one, letting the courtroom settle into silence. And fourth, a prior dependent of Mr. Thorne, his wife Martha Thorne, and their infant child, died on the property in January of 1881. The cause of death was childbed fever, a treatable condition had proper medical care been available. Mr. Thorne's failure to provide that care, his failure to ensure access to a physician, establishes a pattern of negligence that calls into question his fitness to maintain a safe habitation. The courtroom murmured. Silas sat rigid, the scar on his face white as chalk. Margaret Hale stood. She was not a dramatic lawyer. She did not pace or gesture or raise her voice. She spoke the way a blacksmith works metal. Steady heat applied precisely where it was needed. She addressed the cultivation argument first. The Homestead Act requires proof of habitation and improvement, she said. Mr. Thorne has maintained a cabin, a stable, a well, fences, and a productive trapline for 7 continuous years. Territorial precedent in the case of Henderson versus the Denver Land Office, 1882, established that ranching, trapping, and animal husbandry constitute legitimate land improvement when agricultural cultivation is impracticable due to altitude and climate. Blackwood Ridge sits above 10,000 feet. Nothing grows there but pine and columbine. The law does not require a man to grow wheat in granite. She addressed the marriage next. Colorado territory recognizes common law marriage established through cohabitation, mutual agreement, and public representation as husband and wife. Mr. Thorne and Miss Quinn have cohabited since December of 1884. Their correspondence through the matrimonial agency constitutes mutual agreement. Their appearance together in this courtroom constitutes public representation. The marriage is valid under territorial law, and we will register it formally with the county clerk within 30 days as a matter of record. She addressed the military records simply. Every man in the cavalry followed orders at Big Hole. That includes the men now wearing badges in this territory, and the men now sitting on land boards in Denver. If participation in the Nez Perce campaign disqualifies a man from holding land, then half the homesteads in Colorado should be vacated. Cross objected. The judge overruled. Then came the moment Pembroke had been building toward for 5 months. Cross called Silas to testify about Martha. The courtroom went quiet. Silas stood, walked to the witness chair, and sat down. His hands were flat on his thighs. His face was stone. Cross asked the questions with surgical precision. When did Martha Thorne die? How did she die? What efforts did Silas make to obtain medical care? Why did he not bring her down the mountain before the pass closed? Silas answered every question honestly. His voice was steady. The baby came in January of 1881. The fever started 2 days later. The blizzard sealed the pass the same week. 9 days. He could not get through. He tried twice. Nearly died in a snowdrift the second time. He came back to the cabin and found Martha worse. He sat with her. He held the baby when the baby came. The boy lived 6 hours. Martha died 2 hours later. He recited it like a man reading a roster of the dead. Flat. Precise. Without inflection. The scar on his face was stark white. all the blood drained away. The courtroom was silent. Miners who had known Martha, who had seen her ride through town with books in her saddlebags and a smile on her face, stared at the floor. Ruth Avery wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and was angry at herself for doing it. Cross pressed. Would you agree that if you had taken your wife to a lower elevation before the winter, she would have survived? Silas looked at the lawyer. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. Childbed fever kills women in Denver and St. Louis and New York City same as it does on a mountain. But I think about it every day. Margaret Hale stood for rebuttal, but she did not call a witness. She did something no one expected. She addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying through the silent room, Mr. Thorne lost his wife and child to a mountain winter. He dug their graves with his own hands in frozen ground, and then he stayed on that mountain for 7 years, alone, maintaining the land, improving the property, living with the memory of what he lost in the very cabin where he lost them. If that is not proof of commitment to a homestead, then the word has no meaning. The silence that followed was absolute. Cross had no response. Pembroke, sitting at the table, showed no expression, but his pen had stopped moving. The judge called Ilara to testify next. She walked to the witness chair and sat down. She was small in that chair, her patched dress and work-roughened hands out of place in even this rough courtroom. But her spine was straight, her eyes were level. Her hands lay flat on the table and they were not shaking. Cross went for the $12. Is it true, he said, that you stole $12 from your stepfather, Declan Foley, before fleeing Chicago? Ilara did not hesitate. She did not flinch. She had known this was coming. Thomas had told her that in a courtroom, surprises kill. She had decided weeks ago that the only defense against the truth was more truth. Yes, she said. I took $12 from a tin box in his desk. So you are, by your own admission, a thief. I took $12 from a man who sold me for $200. The courtroom stirred. Cross frowned. Sold you? Ilara told the story, all of it. Foley's gambling debts, the labor indenture, her name forged in his handwriting, the brothel on Wabash Avenue, the $200 price on her body. The $12 she took to buy a train ticket to a place where no one could cash that contract. She told it the way Silas had told his story, flat, precise, without drama or self-pity. These are the facts. This is what happened. Make of it what you will. What? The courtroom was quiet. Ruth Avery, sitting in the back row, nodded once. I took $12 from a man who sold me for $200, Ilara repeated. If that makes me a thief, then I am a thief. But I am also alive, and I am standing in this room as a free woman, and no piece of paper filed by the man who tried to sell me will change that. Ruth took the stand next. She confirmed the bruises she had seen on Ilara's wrists the night she arrived. Old bruises, layered, the kind that come from being restrained repeatedly over a period of years. Thomas took the stand after Ruth. He confirmed Silas's 7 years of continuous habitation and land maintenance. He confirmed the quality of the cabin, the stable, the fences, the trap line. He confirmed that Silas Thorne, whatever else he was, had maintained that property through 7 winters that would have killed a lesser man. The judge called a recess. The courtroom emptied into the spring afternoon. Miners lit pipes. Women gathered in small groups and spoke in low voices. Pembroke approached Ilara in the alley beside the saloon. He was calm. He was always calm. That was what made him dangerous. You performed well in there, he said. He was not complimenting her. He was measuring her. I want you to understand something, Miss Quinn. If the judge rules in your favor today, Consolidated will appeal to the territorial court in Denver, then to the circuit court. We have the resources to litigate this for years. Do you? He was not threatening. He was stating a fact. And facts, when spoken by a man with the full weight of a mining corporation behind him, are the most dangerous weapons of all. The judge returned. The courtroom filled. The verdict came. Silas Thorne's homestead claim was provisionally upheld. The cabin, the stable, the well, the fences, and the trap line constituted sufficient improvement under territorial precedent. The common law marriage was recognized, but must be formally registered with the county clerk within 30 days to complete the filing. The theft charge from Illinois held no jurisdiction in Colorado territory, and no extradition order had been issued. The claim regarding Martha's death was noted, but did not meet the standard for disqualification. They had won. But Pembroke, sitting in the back of the courtroom as the verdict was read, did not look defeated. He looked patient. He leaned to his assistant and whispered something. The assistant wrote it down. Outside, in the afternoon light, Elara stood beside Silas on the boardwalk. The town moved around them. People nodded. Some tipped their hats. A few offered congratulations. The world had shifted just slightly in their favor. "We need to register the marriage," Elara said. "I know," Silas said. He looked at her. "But this time I do not want to do it because of a deadline, or a deed, or a piece of land." He paused. "This time I want to mean it." Silas Thorne had faced down grizzly bears, survived an avalanche on Mosquito Pass, and held his ground when 3 consolidated men rode up to his property line with shotguns across their saddles. But nothing on this earth had prepared him. For the moment, Elara Quinn looked him straight in the eye and said the words that changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday in June, not a special day, no orchestrated moment, no sunset or moonlight, or any of the things that the stories say are supposed to accompany declarations of the heart. She was standing by the cook stove, flour on her hands, a strand of hair falling across her face, and she said it the way she said everything, directly, without decoration, like a woman who had learned that words cost too much to waste. "I do not want to marry you for a piece of paper, Silas. I want to marry you because I choose you." He stood in the doorway of the cabin, his coat half off, one boot still wet from the creek, and he stared at her. The words hit him the way the Nez Perce woman's knife had hit him at Big Hole, clean and fast and in a place he had not thought to defend. "I know what you did," she said. "I know what you dream about every night. I know you think anyone who gets close to you ends up buried on this ridge, but you gave me the one thing no one else ever gave me, the right to leave, and I am using that right to stay." Silas did not say, "I love you." Those words were too small for what he felt and too easy for what they had survived. Instead, he said, "I will build you a house that does not burn. Wood burns. Stone does not. A promise made in materials, not words." That was who he was, and she understood it completely. They married in the small church in Elk Fork on a Saturday morning in late June. The justice of the peace was a retired mining engineer who had performed more funerals than weddings and treated both with the same solemn efficiency. Ruth Avery stood as witness, wearing her buffalo coat despite the warm weather because Ruth Avery did not own a dress. Thomas Delacroix stood as best man, his boots polished to a shine that the miners at the ceremony would talk about for weeks. There was no crowd, no spectacle, no silk bustles or velvet cloaks. Elara wore a cotton dress, new, bought with the proceeds from the spring fur sale, white with blue flowers. Simple, clean, hers. Silas wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard for the first time in 4 years. The scar was fully visible, a white line against brown skin, and he did not try to hide it. Margaret Hale filed the marriage certificate with the county clerk that same afternoon. The homestead claim was now ironclad on paper. But the paper was not why they had come. The wedding night was not written in the language of romance novels. There were no swept curtains or whispered endearments. Silas's hands, the hands that had swung an axe and pulled a trigger and dug 2 graves in frozen ground, hesitated at the buttons of her dress. He was afraid of his own strength, afraid that the hands that had killed could not learn to be gentle. Elara, who had never been touched without someone taking something from her, flinched at the first brush of his fingers on her shoulder, then steadied herself, then reached for him. They came together slowly, awkwardly, honestly. 2 people who had forgotten, or never learned, what it was to be touched with tenderness. It was not perfect. It was real. In the morning, Thomas brought news. Declan Foley had withdrawn the theft complaint. Not because Foley had found his conscience. Because Pembroke had stopped funding him after the hearing. Without Consolidated's money, a boarding house owner from Chicago could not afford an attorney to pursue extradition across 2,000 miles. The threat of Foley dissolved the way threats usually dissolve in the real world, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet grinding of economics. When the money stopped, the monster stopped. But Pembroke was not finished. He could not take the land through the courts. The judge had ruled. The marriage was registered. The homestead claim was solid. So Pembroke did what Consolidated always did when the front door was locked. He went around to the side. Within 3 weeks, Consolidated purchased the mining claim on the parcel directly adjacent to Blackwood Ridge. They brought in equipment. They brought in men. And they began blasting. The dynamite charges went off twice a day, shaking the ground, sending pillars of rock dust into the sky, scattering the game, poisoning the creek with tailings runoff. The noise alone was enough to spook the horses and crack the window glass. All of it legal. Consolidated was operating on their own claim. They had every right to mine their own land. But the purpose was clear. Make Blackwood Ridge unlivable. Make the noise and the dust and the poisoned water so intolerable that Silas Thorne would eventually walk into Pembroke's office and sign the deed over just to make it stop. Ilara stood on the porch of the old cabin and watched the dust clouds rise from the valley. She rested her hand on her stomach, an unconscious gesture, the kind of thing a woman does before she understands why. Her body knew something her mind had not yet assembled into words. She looked at the dust. Then she looked at the crate of law books that Margaret Hale had left behind after the hearing. Ilara had been reading them every night for 2 weeks, the same way she had read the Milton in the Cellar, quietly, carefully, absorbing words the way dry earth absorbs rain. She had found something. She was not ready to say what. But her eyes, when Silas came to stand beside her on the porch, had the same look they had on the night she picked the lock on Foley's door in Chicago. Calculating, certain, dangerous. "They will not stop," she said. Silas nodded. "Then neither will we," she said. Christmas of 1885, 1 year to the day since she stepped off the train in patched cotton and newspaper-stuffed boots. Ilara Thorne, no longer Quinn, stood at the window of the stone house and did not recognize the woman reflected in the glass. Not because she was beautiful, because she was no longer looking down. The stone house had been finished in October. It rose from the granite bedrock of Blackwood Ridge like it had always been there, a fortress of gray rock with a slate roof and wide windows of rolled glass that caught the morning light. Silas had quarried the stone himself with help from the miners who came up on weekends, men who worked for Consolidated during the week and worked for Silas on their own time because he paid in coin and treated them like men. The house was not a mansion. It was a home, warm and solid and built to last. But the house was not the victory. The victory belonged to Ilara, and it was made of paper, not stone. It happened in late October, 3 weeks before the first snow. Ilara sat at the kitchen table of the new house past midnight, surrounded by Margaret Hale's law books, a geological survey map she had purchased with her egg money from the Territorial Land Office, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Silas came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. He found her bent over a book with a pencil in her hand, tracing lines on the survey map. He leaned over her shoulder and read the letter she had drafted. Then he read it again. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "From the crate of books the mice had not gotten to," she said. Ilara had found the weapon that would end the war. It was not a rifle, it was not dynamite. It was a statute, the Apex Law, one of the most litigated and consequential pieces of mining legislation in Colorado Territory. The law stated that the owner of the surface land where a mineral vein reaches its highest point, its apex, holds legal rights to the entire vein, even where that vein extends laterally beneath neighboring claims. The principle had been fought over in courtrooms from Leadville to Aspen, and it was settled law. Ilara had studied the geological survey. The silver vein that Consolidated was mining from their adjacent claim ran northwest to southeast through the granite. It passed under both properties. But the vein's apex, the point where it reached the surface, was on Blackwood Ridge, on Silas's land. Consolidated was not mining their own silver. They were mining his. The letter Ilara drafted was addressed not to Pembroke, but to the board of directors of Consolidated Silver Mining Company in Denver. She bypassed the man on the ground and went straight to the men who controlled the money. The letter was 3 pages long, precisely written, citing case law and survey data. The message was simple. Either Consolidated negotiates a fair partnership, shared extraction rights with royalty payments to the Thorne family and minimum safety standards for the miners, or the Thornes file suit under the Apex law and Consolidated loses its entire Elk Fork investment. Silas read the letter a 3rd time. He looked at his wife. He looked at the woman who had arrived on his doorstep 8 months ago, weighing 100 pounds, soaking wet, dressed in rags, unable to buy a bowl of soup. The woman who had split his wood and bound his ribs and survived his blizzard and sat through his confession and stood in a courtroom and told the truth about who she was without flinching. He understood now. She had never needed him to save her. She had needed the opportunity to save herself. And he had given it to her, not with a rifle or a fist, but with a shelf of books and enough silence to let her think. The board's response came in November. They sent an attorney, not Harlan Cross, but a senior partner, a man who looked at Ilara's letter and the survey maps and the case citations and understood immediately that Consolidated was exposed. Pembroke had created a catastrophic legal liability by mining into a vein that apexed on someone else's land. Josiah Pembroke was recalled to Denver, not arrested, not shot, not dragged through the streets in irons. He was dismissed, fired by memo, the same way he had tried to destroy Silas and Ilara, by paper and procedure. The system he had built and weaponized consumed him, the way such systems always consume the men who build them, quietly, efficiently, without drama or fanfare. He left Elk Fork on a winter train. Nobody saw him off. Nobody noticed him go. He sat in the second-class car in his fine wool vest with his gold-rimmed spectacles in his pocket and watched the mountains recede through the window and said nothing to anyone. He was, in the end, exactly what he had always been, a company man. And when the company was done with him, he disappeared. The partnership agreement was signed in December. Silas retained full ownership of Blackwood Ridge. Consolidated provided the equipment, the labor, and the capital. Profit split 60-40 in the Thornes' favor. And there was one additional clause, written in Ilara's handwriting and non-negotiable. Minimum safety standards in the mine. Fair wages paid in United States coin, not company scrip. And Thomas Delacroix named as site foreman. Christmas Eve, 1885. The stone house was warm. A fire burned in the massive stone hearth. The windows, wide and clean, looked out onto a world wrapped in white. Snow fell gently from a sky the color of pewter. And for once the wind was still. No grand party, no crowd, just 4 people in the great room. Ruth Avery, who had brought a pie and a bottle of whiskey and the same buffalo coat she had been wearing the night Ilara stepped off the train. Thomas Delacroix, who had brought a new bugle he'd ordered from a catalog in Denver, and played a quiet, slightly off-key rendition of Silent Night that made everyone smile and no one critique. The station master, who had sent a package up by courier, a crate of new books from a Denver bookseller, Silas's Christmas gift to Ilara. In the corner of the great room stood a spruce tree 12 feet tall, draped in strings of dried cranberries and popcorn and silver stars that the miners had hammered out of the first ore pulled from the Thorne claim. It was not a sad, bare sapling with a single ribbon. It was a tree dressed for celebration, and the light from the fire made the silver stars wink like something alive. Ruth poured the whiskey. Thomas told a story about a mule he had known in the cavalry that was smarter than any officer he had served under. Ruth laughed, which was rare enough that everyone noticed. Silas sat in his chair by the fire and watched the room with the quiet, steady gaze of a man who was trying to memorize something he never thought he would have. Later, when Ruth and Thomas had gone, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals and the house was quiet, Silas took Ilara's hand and led her out to the porch. The snow was falling. The valley below was dark except for the scattered lamplight of Elk Fork, gold pinpoints in the white expanse. The mountains stood in silhouette against a sky full of stars, enormous and indifferent and older than anything human. Silas turned her gently toward the back of the house. Two wooden crosses stood in the cleared ground behind the new stone wall. He had moved them, carried them from the old cabin site, which was now just a scorched clearing being slowly reclaimed by wildflowers and creeping thyme, up to here. He had sanded the wood smooth. He had recarved the tops. He had planted them in fresh earth surrounded by a small border of stacked stones, neat and deliberate, the work of a man who was done hiding. "I am done pretending they are not here," he said. His voice was rough the way it got when the words were coming from somewhere deeper than his throat. "She is part of this mountain, same as you, same as me." Ilara looked at the crosses, Martha and the unnamed boy, named. The woman who came before, the child who never got to be. She did not feel jealousy. She did not feel sadness, or not only sadness. She felt gratitude, strange and unexpected, for a woman she had never met. Because Martha had loved this man first. Martha had seen something in Silas Thorne worth crossing the mountains for. And even though the mountains had taken her, the love she left behind was the reason Silas was still standing on this ridge at all. Without Martha's ghost, Ilara might never have understood the depth of the man she had married. She knelt in the snow. She placed a sprig of winter pine on each cross. She stayed there for a moment, her hand resting on the cold wood, her breath making clouds in the still air. Then she stood. She took Silas's hand. That hand. The one that had swung an axe, pulled a trigger, dug two graves, bound a bandage, steadied a horse, held a dying child for 6 hours. She lifted that hand and placed it deliberately on the curve of her stomach. "Spring," she said, "when the wildflowers come back." Silas went still, absolutely still. The kind of still that was not absence of movement, but the presence of everything, every fear, every hope, every prayer. He had stopped praying years ago, arriving all at once in a single moment. He felt it, under the heavy fabric of her dress, a firmness, a roundness that had not been there in the summer. And then, faint as a moth's wing against a window, a flutter, a movement, a life. His eyes found hers. And in those eyes she saw something she had never seen before. Not the exhaustion that had been there the night they met. Not the stone wall he wore like armor. Not even the grief that lived behind every word he spoke and every silence he kept. What she saw was terror and wonder, and a hope so fragile it looked like it might shatter if either of them breathed too hard. "A baby," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "A spring baby," she said. Tears were running down her face, freezing on her cheeks before they reached her jaw. "When the wildflowers come." Silas did not kneel. He did not collapse. He stood exactly where he was, 6 feet and 4 inches of scarred, weathered, mountain-hardened man. And he pulled her into his chest and held her so tight she could feel his heart beat through the wolf-pelt coat. His face was buried in her hair. His shoulders shook once, then again, and she understood that the great Silas Thorne, the man the whole territory was afraid of, was crying for the first time in 4 years. Not for Martha, not for the boy. For the future he had been certain he did not deserve. "I will protect you," he said into her hair, and his voice was wrecked. "Both of you, against the wind, against the cold, against every man who thinks he has a claim on what is ours. I will stand between you and the dark until the mountains come down." Ilara pulled back just enough to see his face. She reached up and traced the scar with her fingertip from temple to jaw, the full length of his history. "I know you will," she said. You chose me when I was nothing but rags and newspaper boots and 3 copper pennies. You saw a wife when everyone else saw a beggar." Silas caught her hand. He held it against the scar. "You were never rags, Alara," he said fiercely. "You were just wrapped in them. I just had to look close enough to see what was underneath." She smiled. The same smile he had seen for the first time on New Year's Eve by the fire when she told him she could read. But fuller now, warmer. The smile of a woman who had walked through fire and winter and come out the other side holding something she never thought she would have. A home, a husband, a future growing under her heart. "If it is a girl," she said, "I want to name her Martha." Silas closed his eyes. He pressed his forehead against hers. The snow fell around them, soft and white and silent. "And if it is a boy," he said, his voice rough but steady now, "I will teach him to read before I teach him to shoot." Ilara laughed. The sound rang out across the snow, bright and clear and startling. "I will teach him to shoot," she said. "You teach him the books." Silas laughed. A real laugh. Full and deep and unguarded, the kind of laugh that comes from a place that has been locked shut so long that the sound surprises even the person making it. The kind of laugh that echoes. It carried out into the still, cold air. It rolled down the slope of Blackwood Ridge. It drifted over the tree line and the frozen creek, and the trail that wound down to the valley where Elk Fork sat in its nest of lamplight. And if anyone in the town below happened to be standing outside on their porch that Christmas Eve, looking up at the dark shape of the mountain, they might have heard it. A sound that did not belong to Blackwood Ridge. A sound that had never been heard on that ridge before. Laughter. The wind on Blackwood Ridge that night was cold, same as every winter night before it, and every winter night still to come. The mountains did not care about love or loss or silver or law. They stood the way they had always stood, enormous and indifferent and eternal. But inside the stone house, the fire held steady. The windows glowed gold. 2 wooden crosses stood in the snow behind the wall, draped in winter pine. And 2 people who had arrived in each other's lives with nothing but damage and desperation stood on a porch in the falling snow and held on to each other like the world was trying to shake them loose. It was not. Not anymore. The war was over. The mountain was home. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Blackwood Ridge was not silent. It had laughter. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.